They called it Ruth Callahan's Folly before they called it anything else, and for 2 full years the name stuck to her like burrs on a wool skirt, impossible to shake off no matter how she scrubbed at her pride. It began on an ordinary spring morning when the ground was still soft from the last decent rain the county would see for a long, long while, and Ruth stood at the edge of her late husband's cornfield with a shovel in her hands and a plan in her head that nobody else could see the sense of. She was 34 years old, widowed 18 months, and the mother of 2 children who ate like the harvest depended on it, which, as it happened, it did. Her husband Daniel had died of a fever the winter before last, leaving her 160 acres of dry prairie soil, a leaning barn, 2 mules, and a debt at the bank that grew a little heavier every time she thought about it. The neighbors said she should sell. They said a woman alone couldn't run a farm through a bad year, let alone through what the old-timers were already calling the driest stretch anyone could remember. But Ruth had grown up on this land, had watched her own father dig irrigation trenches by hand back before the county put in the big canal that mostly benefited the farms closer to the river, and she remembered something he used to say, that water doesn't care who owns the ground it wants to reach, it only cares about finding the lowest path. So instead of selling, instead of praying alone in the dark and waiting for the sky to change its mind, Ruth started digging. She dug for 6 weeks straight, mornings before the children woke and evenings after they were down, carving a shallow curved channel from the small spring-fed creek that cut along the northern edge of her property down toward the low flat stretch where she intended to plant her garden. It wasn't much of a creek, barely wider than a wagon wheel in most places, fed by an underground spring that never quite dried up even in the worst years, though it slowed to a trickle by August. Her plan was simple in the way that only truly desperate plans are simple. Instead of one straight ditch that could silt up or collapse in a single storm, she would build a wide, gentle, curving channel that circled almost the whole way around a plot of ground, so that no matter which direction the water came from or how the land shifted after a hard rain, the garden inside that ring would always have moisture close by, soaking sideways into the soil even when there wasn't enough to flood the rows directly. She lined the inside edge with flat stones gathered from the dry creek bed 2 miles east, hauling them back in the wagon a load at a time, packing them tight so the water wouldn't eat away the bank and swallow her careful work in the first big storm. Her son Thomas, only 9, thought it was the most wonderful thing his mother had ever built, a moat. He called it, like the ones in the picture books at the schoolhouse, and he ran along the curve of it pretending to defend a castle that existed only in his imagination. Her daughter Sarah, 12 and already old enough to worry the way children shouldn't have to, asked her mother more than once if she was certain this would work, and Ruth always gave the same answer. "I don't know if it will work," she said. "I only know that doing nothing certainly won't." The men of the county found out about the ditch the way men in small farming counties find out about everything, which is to say almost immediately and with considerable embellishment. Ruth's nearest neighbor, a heavy-set farmer named Elias Pruitt, who had once offered, not entirely kindly, to buy her land at half its worth, rode past one afternoon and sat on his horse at the fence line laughing so hard he had to wipe his eyes with his sleeve. "A ditch," he said, shaking his head. "A woman digging herself a ditch shaped like a circle, as if the water gives a damn what shape you dig it." He told the men at the feed store about it that same evening, and by the following Sunday half the congregation at the little clapboard church had heard some version of the story, most of them considerably less flattering than the truth. They called it Ruth's Folly. They called it the useless ditch because everyone knew, or thought they knew, that a proper irrigation channel needed to run straight and needed to run downhill in a single determined line, the way the big canal did, the way real farmers had always done it. A circle made no sense to men who had never had to think sideways about a problem because the straight way had always been available to them. Ruth heard the talk, of course. She heard it from the woman at the general store who pretended to be sympathetic while her eyes danced with amusement, and she heard it more directly from Pastor Whitfield's wife, who suggested, in the gentlest possible voice, that perhaps Ruth might consider accepting help from someone who understood these things better than a grieving widow could be expected to. Ruth thanked her for her concern and went home and kept digging. By the time the ditch was finished, the last week of May, the sky had already begun its long betrayal. The rains that should have come regular through early summer arrived instead in thin, half-hearted showers that wet the surface of the ground and nothing more, gone within an hour, leaving the deep soil as parched as it had been before. By the middle of June, the county newspaper ran its first article about the drought. Careful and measured in its language, the way newspapers are when they don't yet know how bad a thing is going to get. By the 4th of July, nobody needed the newspaper to tell them. The corn in Elias Pruitt's fields, tall and proud in May, had begun to curl and yellow at the tips. The wheat 2 farms over came in thin and brittle, barely worth the cost of the harvest. The big canal that fed the larger farms closer to the river ran lower every week, and the farmers who depended on it began taking turns, arguing over whose fields got water on which days, tempers rising along with the temperature. Livestock troughs went dry faster than anyone could haul water to refill them. The whole county seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a rain that wasn't coming, watching the dust rise off roads that used to be mud by this time of year. Ruth's garden, inside its ring of stone and slow-moving water, stayed green. It wasn't magic, though later, after everything, some of the more superstitious among her neighbors half wondered if it was. It was hydrology, though Ruth herself would not have used that word, having no more than a country schoolhouse education and a lifetime of watching her father work the land. The circular channel she dug caught what little water the spring produced and held it, moving slowly around the whole loop instead of rushing straight through and out, giving the ground far more time to drink it in sideways through capillary action, the way a dry sponge pulls water up from just touching its edge to a puddle. The stone she'd lined the banks with kept the channel from collapsing or silting shut the way a plain dirt ditch would have, especially during the rare hard rains that came through violent and fast, more likely to wash away topsoil than nourish it. And because the ring encircled the garden rather than running through it in a straight line, every single row of vegetables sat close to moisture no matter which side of the plot it was on, instead of the rows nearest the water thriving while the far rows withered, which was the usual fate of a straight irrigation ditch during a dry spell. Her tomatoes came in fat and red while Elias Pruitt's fields turned the color of old paper. Her corn stood tall enough that Thomas could still hide inside the rows playing his make-believe games while the county's other cornfields were being cut early for what pitiful feed they could still provide. Her squash vines sprawled thick and green over the ground, and her beans climbed the teepees of lashed sticks she'd built for them, heavy with pods, and her flowers, which she'd planted along the inner edge more for her own comfort than for any practical reason, bloomed bright and unbothered by the brutal white sun that had turned the rest of the county the color of old bone. People started coming to look. At first it was just curiosity dressed up as errands, neighbors finding some reason to pass by on the road that ran along her property, slowing their wagons, staring at the impossible green ring in the middle of a dying landscape. Then it became something closer to pilgrimage. Farmers who had laughed loudest at Ruth's folly began finding excuses to stop and ask questions, standing awkwardly at her fence with their hats in their hands, trying to work out how to ask a woman they'd mocked for help without having to actually say the words "I was wrong." Ruth, to her enormous credit, never made them say it. She would walk out to the fence, wipe her hands on her apron, and explain the whole thing patiently, the curve of the channel, the stones, the slow circulation of water instead of the fast straight rush, drawing the shape of it in the dust with a stick if the visitor seemed confused, which most of them did at first, because it really was a different way of thinking about water than any of them had been taught. Elias Pruitt himself came by in late July. 3 weeks after his own well had gone so low, he'd had to start hauling water from the county tank twice a week just to keep his cattle alive. He stood at the fence a long time before he said anything at all, just looking at the green ring of her garden against the brown horizon, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its old mockery in it. "That's a fine piece of work," he said, and Ruth thanked him. And that was the whole conversation, but it traveled through the county faster than any of the jokes ever had. What made the story remarkable, and what people would still be telling their children about years later, wasn't only that Ruth's garden survived the drought while so much of the county's crops failed. It was what happened after, because Ruth didn't hoard the knowledge or the harvest either one. As July burned into August and the drought showed no sign of breaking, and families around the county began quietly worrying about how they'd feed themselves through the winter, Ruth started sharing both. She showed any farmer who asked exactly how to dig a circular channel of their own, exactly how to line the banks, exactly how to angle the intake so it would catch the most from even the smallest trickle of a spring or creek. Not every farm had a water source close enough to make it work, and Ruth was honest about that too. never promising a miracle where the geography simply wouldn't allow one. But for those who did have some little spring or seasonal creek running through their land, places where the water had always been considered too meager to bother with, her method turned out to matter more than anyone would have guessed back in May when they were all laughing at her. And from her own garden, the one that had grown so absurdly, stubbornly abundant while everything around it withered, Ruth gave away baskets of vegetables to families who needed them, not as charity exactly, because she was careful never to frame it that way, but as the plain practical sharing that had always been the unwritten law of hard country living, the same law her own father had lived by and the same law that, not so long before, some of those very families had seemed ready to forget. Where Ruth was concerned. The drought broke in the second week of September, 3 days of steady soaking rain that turned the dust to mud and brought a collective, exhausted relief to the whole county. By then the damage to that year's main crops was already done and couldn't be undone by any amount of rain arriving late, and it would be a hard winter for plenty of families despite it. But it was a less hard winter than it would have been, because Ruth's ring of green had fed more than just her own 2 children through the worst months, and because half a dozen other farms had dug their own version of her circular channel by the time the rains finally came, meaning half a dozen other gardens had held on too, however modestly, adding just enough to the county's larder to matter. At the Harvest Festival that October, the same festival where the year before Ruth had stood mostly alone near the edge of the crowd, feeling the weight of being talked about rather than talked to, Pastor Whitfield stood up before the whole congregation and asked Ruth Callahan to come forward, and in front of everyone, including Elias Pruitt and his wife and the woman from the general store and all the others who had once found her ditch such a source of easy amusement, he thanked her, plainly, and without embellishment, for what her stubbornness had done for the county that year. Ruth, who had never much cared for being the center of attention even when the attention was kind, stood there with her cheeks burning and her son Thomas grinning up at her like she'd hung the moon, and her daughter Sarah standing straight and proud beside her, and she said the only thing that felt true to say, which was that she'd simply done what needed doing, the way her father had taught her, and that the water, in the end, hadn't cared one bit what anybody thought of the shape of the ditch it was asked to run through. The name changed after that, the way names sometimes do when a story finishes proving itself. Nobody called it Ruth's Folly anymore. Within a year or two, farmers 3 counties over were asking about the woman who dug the circle ditch, and Ruth, though she never sought it out and would have been embarrassed to hear herself described this way, became something like a quiet local legend. The widow who'd outsmarted a drought that broke stronger farms than hers, using nothing but a shovel, a stubborn streak, and a memory of the things her father used to say about water finding its own way. She never remarried, though there was no shortage of men in the years after who found reason to admire more than just her farming, and she raised Thomas and Sarah on that same 160 acres until they were grown, Thomas eventually taking over the farm himself and keeping the ring of stone and water exactly as his mother had built it, repairing it stone by stone whenever a hard winter cracked the banks, because he understood, the way she'd taught him to understand, that some of the best ideas in the world look like foolishness right up until the moment they don't. And on quiet summer evenings for the rest of her long life, Ruth Callahan liked to walk the curve of that old channel alone, listening to the water she'd once been laughed at for chasing, watching it circle patiently around the garden that had kept her family fed through the worst summer anyone in that county could remember, and she never once, not for a single day, regretted the 6 weeks she'd spent digging what everyone told her was a useless ditch.